I'm good whenever you guys are.
We're ready.
I'm ready.
Roll it.
It's rolling.
Oh, we got no. Hey, we don't have any.
That's right, I was sitting here waiting for the
Damn it, we don't have any music. So we usually have lead-in music. So we're all sitting here waiting on Brown. Brown's waiting on us. Oh, I knew, man.
Alright, so now we just gotta do it. Okay.
Roll it up. Good.
Okay.
1, 2, 3, go.
You can add music later, can't
Yeah, that's what he's gonna do.
357 Productions is excited to be back with our new podcast, From Darkness to Light. A new podcast for brothers by brothers and basically doing what we want, when we want.
Dang right.
Our first episode, we're honored to have Brother Kieran Kidd all the way from the Oregon Trail. That's
Yes.
what we've been told. So we are glad to have Brother Kidd. And for a formal introduction, I'm gonna turn it over to Brother B.
All right, so we've I've been wanting to get Karen for a long time, and so Karen's here doing this podcast again because she's going to be our guest speaker at Sophia. So when we get those guys in, any of the national level speakers, we try to grab them, and we have Karen coming to talk to us, and so we grabbed her for a podcast. More or less, the reason that we wound up with Karen is because two things. One, most of us know not a darn thing about co-masonry. What do you know about co-masonry? Yeah, me too. I know nothing. So, it's part of the overall Masonic envelope, and I know nothing about it. So we're always wanting to learn about stuff that we don't know anything about, so we decided to get an expert. And the second reason that she's here is because she is the definitive expert as far as I'm concerned, because she's the only co-mason I know. So, anybody that knows a little bit more about something than you do is an expert, right? So Karen is our expert. The reason I know her is because she is a prolific Masonic author. And you guys probably have heard of her to some degree. She's got, I have 2 of her books. One of them is On Holy Ground. One of them is Haunted Chambers. What are the other 2 books, Karen?
One is an expanded biography of Catherine Babington, who I'll be talking about later today.
Cool.
I can't remember the full title they gave that. The 4th one isn't out yet, but it's a fuller biography of the founders of Co-masonry in North America.
Right on. So you can find all of your books on Amazon?
Oh, yes.
So everybody please go there. After this riveting interview, I'm sure everybody will be beating down the doors to go there and buy our book. She's also been published in Heirdom many times. So Heirdom, for those of you that don't know, they look like this. They come from the Scottish Rite Research Society. You do not have to be a member of the Scottish Rite to be a member of the Scottish Rite Research Society.
I'm a member.
There you go. Put out a book every year with academic papers in it. She's in number 19, 22, 24, 25, and I understand there's even possibly one coming after that.
Well, 25 is the one coming.
Oh, 25 is the one that I've got right here.
Ah.
I've already got my 25. I don't know about everybody else, but my 25 is here.
Mine is not.
Well, see, I have the secret insight. See, I'm tight with those guys up there, so they send me a pre-copy.
Oh, good.
He's a superstar.
Me and Brent
Here in North Carolina.
like this. Okay, so in all seriousness, we're thrilled to have you. Karen comes to us from Oregon, where she is a co-mason. I understand that you were a military brat growing up. We had a lot of conversation in the truck yesterday coming back from the airport. Mainly, Karen was telling me stuff, and I was
trying to stay awake.
I was fighting my way down through Charlotte traffic at about 6 o'clock, and so and trying not to get us killed. So I probably heard most of it. But you said that you were a military brat, so you kind of kicked around the world growing up. Was in Florida for a while. You said you were in North Carolina for a while. Wound up in the great state of Oregon. Understand that, and as far as college, we talked about your college. You want to give a shout out to the Thunder and Herd?
Yes, Marshall University. I've never been to a game, but yeah, I know about the sports ball and all that.
Yeah, well, I think you're on sports ball. Old sports ball. We still a member of the Thunder and Herd.
Yes.
Even with or without sports, right? Okay, so and Karen primarily as a journalist.
Yes.
Yep, make your living mostly as a journalist, has a degree in journalism, or undergrad is in journalism. And then you have your other degree was in, tell me again.
Basic Humanities with a leaning in Religious Studies. It's a long degree.
So here's what we're really trying to say. Karen's really smart. Well published, really smart, academic historian. Even though your degree's not in history, I think you would probably consider yourself, right after a journalist, a historian. Would that be a fair statement?
I think over the past decade, I've established my credit as a Masonic historian. I don't know if my academic friends would allow me to say that I'm a historian in general.
Right. Well, they are very specific. Most of those academic historians are very specific. Words really, 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 really matter to them.
Well, they can be. I'm a member of the Hannah Mather Crocker Society, and the only one who isn't in some way tied to a university. I'm referred to as an independent scholar.
I see.
So.
Well, good. Well, we're glad that you are, because you shed an awful lot of light on a subject that most of us don't know much about. Let's talk just a little bit about how you got into Freemasonry. How did you become a Freemason? How does one find the Co-masons?
Not everyone finds it the same way. In my case, a friend of mine had himself become a Freemason, and he was in a lodge that requires you to study as you move through the degrees. So it's very impressive. But he doesn't like to study. So I helped him study. And then, his lodge found out about me and he got in trouble. But in the process of just reading and working with him, I was already active online. I'm sure you all remember a fellow, he is demitted from his lodge, but his name was Stephen Defoe.
Yes.
And he had a forum, he'll hate me, I can't remember the name of the forum, but it was mostly about Templars. And I started making a pest of myself on the Masonic page of that forum. And there were two people there, Gele and Red Knight, who told me, you don't have to do this by yourself. And they were the ones who introduced me to Co-masonry. Now, both of them are Mailcraft Masons. So that was my path to Co-masonry. Not everybody goes the same way.
And then, so this all started online, but
Yes.
eventually you found your way to a real brick and mortar building with real life people. How did that
Yes.
happen?
Well, for me, not everyone goes the same way, but for me, it started with sending a message to the Order's website. The Order is located in Larkspur, Colorado. That's where the main campus is.
You told me that was between Denver and the Springs.
Yeah, Denver's here, Colorado Springs is here, and Larkspur is right in the middle.
Beautiful part of the country.
Yes, it is.
Very nice. Okay, so you sent them an email, and the next thing you know, you've met somebody in your local area.
Yeah, well, not local. I travel 4 hours each month to go to lodge. There's
some dedication.
Thank you. There's presently no lodge in my order in Oregon. The nearest one is we refer to it as the Orient of Seattle. We actually meet in Tacoma. Very
nice. Good. So, and you got you said a person or two from your area that rides with you occasionally?
Yes, it's sort of a mix of carpool and study, all the way up.
Yeah, nice. So, eventually you find a lodge. You're initiated, passed, and raised. You told me that in your lodge that process takes a couple of years.
Oh, at least I know there are people I know now who are not yet raised. Some people it takes a long time. But I do know people that when I became a Mason, they were still either just initiated or fellow crafts, and they still are. And of course, I also know people who are up in the 30s. It depends on the individual process or the individual path.
Right. So this is kind of a European idea, right? I mean, in the States, we rush guys through just as quick as we can, right? As soon as we can get them initiated, and as soon as we can cram a catechism in their head, the quicker they get that done, the better a Mason everybody thinks they are. And as a matter of fact, we even have a rule that says that if they don't get passed in 6 months, they got to write a letter explaining why. And that's kind of just the opposite of the way that the traditional observance lodges look at it, and it's opposite of the way that most folks in Europe look at it. And I certainly think that in that particular case, we're on the wrong side of that thing. I mean, there's no reason to be in a race. You're supposed to learn the lessons as you go along, right?
Well, I think I'm a big proponent of choice. For some people, the overnight thing works. When I try to explain it, I try and describe it as the difference between a modern marriage for love and the more medieval idea where it was basically a business arrangement. And the success rates of both sets of marriages are about 50-50. We're no better now than we were in the medieval period. But the difference is back then most of the marriages were arranged, and today you don't. And so if you think of the arranged marriage as maybe being the weekend class, you've got about a 50-50 chance of succeeding. If you think of the way that it's done in my order, where you start here and you work your way over a period of years and a period of self-reflection, that's more the marriage of love. Again, 50-50 chance. Not everybody makes it. And I don't think I would have liked to have come up in an overnight thing, but I had the option of not doing it that way.
Right.
Some people, it works to do it that fast. Some people, it doesn't. I think the option should be there.
Yeah, I like it. So eventually you made your way through the chairs. You're now the immediate past master, you said?
Yes, very happy IPM.
Out of curiosity, is that an actual chair for y'all? Is that an official title?
Yes,
Immediate past
you
master?
sit to the left of. I didn't know you didn't do this in your
Yeah,
orders.
no. In North
Yeah.
Carolina, we don't. So, but
dear.
in Europe, pretty much all of them do in Europe. I know that the times that I visited in Europe, that was always an official position. The immediate past master is sitting right there to the left
Right
of the
there.
master,
And doing all the whispering and stuff. Yes.
Yeah, giving guidance, providing some continuity and some wisdom to the guy that's in charge. And I think it's a great idea. We're kind of bringing that back at Sophia. Our immediate past master, I attempt to get him to sit with me in the East every time that I can. Oftentimes he's pressed into other duties sometimes, but when I can, trying to get him to sit up there with me. And I just like that idea. I think the idea of having a guy sitting next to you that's been there and done that for a couple of years could, who, and I'm speaking to our people now, Karen, who hasn't been sitting in the East, something comes up and you don't know what to do?
Need counsel.
And usually you look over at the secretary, right? Brother Secretary, what do we do about that? What do we do now? But that really should, and that's good, because the secretaries, often are your tugboat mentality. They're the guys that are keeping things in line. But it sure would be nice to have that immediate past master sitting there that could whisper you some good counsel on the fly and help in a situation. So I like that idea, Karen. I like the idea of the immediate past master, and maybe we'll make our way back to that. So good. All right, so just to stay with the progression of your order, before we go on to the history part, which is really going to be the focus of this thing, you said that you haven't, but your people have the option of then going into a higher degree system.
Oh yes.
You have you didn't call it York, right? What did you?
We call them the English Rite degrees. We work 3 of them.
Yes.
You have
Go
mark,
ahead.
You have the mark, and to the mark is moored the Royal Ark Mariner, and then sort of off to one side is the Holy Royal Arch.
Good. And you have a Scottish Rite system too.
First to the 33rd.
Right. And so this is all your order.
Yes.
Very good. All right, so in a lot of ways they mirror what we do. In a lot of ways they're a little different. That's all good. Let's talk about where you came from. So, I think I was thinking about this morning and how we were going to do this progression, because you kind of told me this whole story backwards last night. We started with you and worked our way back to France. Right. Let's start in France. And kind of work our way forward. So, from the very origins of your order, where did that start?
Well, we come out of the mailcraft. I can trace our origins all the way back to the 17th century, just like any other mailcraft order. We come from mailcraft masonry. But you don't really you have women masons in that period, and these are basically, a lot of it is sort of the whoops genre, because there's a lot of rewriting of history. A lot of these women were initiated intentionally, and this idea that they snuck in sort of is added to their story later to explain why they were there. Not all of them snuck in. Some of them, it was just fine, particularly in country lodges. In city lodges, it was a little more difficult, but in country lodges where things are a little looser, you have people like Mrs. Hall. Sometimes we don't have their first names anymore. You have Isabella Tibskin, I can't remember her last, Schoon. Isabella Schoon in Melrose Lodge. There's no indication that she snuck in or that she accidentally overheard the secrets. From what we can tell, she was just initiated into Melrose Lodge, and that was that. But this is early 17th century. Things are really loose and not well documented. It's only later in that century that genuine belligerence against women Masons is really coming to the fore, particularly with the adoption of Anderson's Constitution and all of that. But there's no period in the modern craft where I can't document at least one woman somewhere in the world, and there were more. As the decades progress, it becomes harder and harder and harder, and you can see evidence of Masonry trying to right that. Things we discussed it earlier, the adoptive ritual, not Order of Eastern Star, but the early stuff, Heroines of Jericho, White Shrine of something, I can't remember the name of the whole thing. These rituals that evolve and arise out of nowhere, and these are degrees that are given to women. Hi. But even that's not enough. Those are not exactly Masonic degrees. These are lodges of adoption. It isn't until, I can't remember the exact date, but it's the 1880s in Le Pec in France. And this is, up until that point, the women that are in these lodges, they're basically male craft masonry, or masons. They're in lodges that are otherwise for men. And there's no evidence that any of these women try to recruit other women to join with them. They recognize themselves as anomalies, and they work within male craft masonry. So it isn't until, I want to say, I'd have to look it up, but I want to say it was 1881 in Le Pec. And it was, my French friends will hate this. I do not speak French well, but I think it was, I'm not going to try. The lodge was
Give
called...
it a shot. Nobody will know.
Oh, no. Somebody will
know.
In English, the name of the lodge was the Freethinkers, which gives you an idea of what sort of lodge this was. This is very humanistic. This is very grounded in the here and now. And they were not the first one to consider initiating a woman, but they were the first one to actually do it. There's a whole story there. And you know very well I can run off in all kinds of directions.
Yeah, so hold that thought.
Hold that thought.
So just to go back a little bit
Okay.
in what you've said so far, I'm sure that our guys, and mainly this is a North Carolina podcast,
Yes.
we'll probably get some national viewing from this, but probably all the lodges in the States, the Malecraft lodges, and especially ours, are saying, how in the world could a woman get initiated? And I think just from a historian standpoint, you have to go back in time, and today we have a lot of Grand Lodge oversight, control, and rules, where the lodges, especially the country lodges back then, were very much no oversight, no rules. They didn't have
Right.
DDGMs. They didn't have code books this thick. It was pretty much left to the individual lodges to make both their own ritual and their own, rules. In our ritual in North Carolina, we specifically prohibit making a woman, a female, a mason in one of our lodges. But that probably wasn't always in there. We think that those things in our obligations are verbatim taken from all the way back to at least 1717 and probably back to the building of the temple in Israel, and that's just not the case. I mean, these things evolve over time, yes? And we even talked about the idea that probably with the lesson coming right after the test sometimes, probably some of those things. In North Carolina ritual, if the guys will think about it, that is a very long sentence that talks about all of those things that we will not do. And probably the reason, Karen and I were discussing this in general last night, that sentence is so long and fragmented is because we first said we weren't going to do this,
altered.
and then, and we also won't do that because it happened. And then, and we also won't do that because it happened. So we kept adding the things that we're not going to do because they were happening.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. So I just wanted you guys to kind of think about it.
You don't
in that
make a
light.
rule until someone breaks it.
Exactly, yes. Exactly. So it's not such a crazy idea that it happened that some women were made Freemasons because it wasn't specifically prohibited until it started happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So let's go back to France. Pick up your story where you left off.
The Freethinkers in Le Pec, they initiated a woman. Now, she's not well known here, but in France she is. She was basically as famous as, say, Susan B. Anthony or Katie Staton or some of our women's rights advocates in this country. Mm-hmm. Her name was Marie de Rem. She was initiated into Le Pec, and she is the first woman who could properly be referred to as a co-mason, although she would not have called herself a co-mason. The word co-mason was actually penned or coined by the founder of the order I belong to. His name was Antoine Mazzarelli. He was the first one to use the phrase co-mason. In her time, she would have said mixed, M-I-X-T-E, a mixed mason. And that means men and women. You have to intend to be a mixed lodge before you can really refer to yourself as a co-mason. And she was the first woman Freemason who could have properly been referred to as a co-mason. The intent has to be there. You can't just have a situation like Elizabeth Aldworth, who is the earliest known woman Mason in the modern era, who is intentionally initiated into an otherwise male craft lodge, and for the next 60 years worked as a Mason. She was master of her lodge at least once. But there were never any other women in her lodge. Mm-hmm. She is operating in the male craft sphere, whereas Marie Durham is working in mixed masonry. And so that's the beginning, 1880s, of co-masonry. In this country, it arrived in France.
Yeah.
And I guess before we arrive in this country, co-masonry for about a generation was a French manifestation. It wasn't until 1902 when Annie Besant, who has many titles, it's hard for me to really say Annie Besant this. She was an orator, she was a politician, she was an activist, she had many titles, was in her time probably the most famous woman in her time. And she decided to become a co-mason in 1902. And she approached the founders of co-masonry in France and said, I want to take this to the English-speaking world. And they said, cool. And she took it to Great Britain. And so this is the first English-speaking, the first outside of France co-masonry.
And she was in charge of the English-speaking world at the time.
She took it, because none of this happens at once. This is the flashpoint. Mm-hmm. It took her years to spread it through the world, but she didn't. She had Canada, kind of, but since she wasn't in Canada, she wasn't in North America. Usually, when she was doing anything in Canada, she would work through the folks in my order, mm-hmm. And they would do things in Canada. But my order arrives in 1903.
So without going completely down a Annie Besant rabbit hole,
okay.
Tell the folks that don't know about Annie about her theosophical connections.
I should mention that.
And
yes.
And specifically at the time that she was doing this, and then as she progressed just a little bit.
One thing that's very interesting about the non-French speaking co-masons of the early 20th century is they didn't necessarily see Freemasonry as its own end. Annie Besant saw co-masonry, let me put this correctly because I don't want to speak for her, she's dead. But she would have seen it more as a vehicle for theosophy. She had become convinced that co-masonry in particular, Freemasonry in general and co-masonry in particular, had an important role to play in the distant future. I mean, beyond us. And there needed to be a certain amount of evolution in Freemasonry to make it ready for this important role that it had to play. And for her, that meant you had to include the other half of the human race. And which to me sounds very simple, but in her time it was really difficult. So for her, it was a vehicle for theosophy. And therefore, most of her lodges would have more of a theosophical bent. That doesn't mean you didn't have non-theosophists. You did. But for her, and you see it in a lot of her letters, there would be special knowledge for brothers who were theosophists, and there would be special privileges. You were more likely to sit in a chair if you were a theosophist.
So tell everybody what a theosophist is.
Oh my goodness, because I'm not a theosophist. So, baby, ow, that hurts. Here we go. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
If anybody was listening instead of actually watching the podcast, the cat got Karen. So. Okay.
That's okay. So it's sort of like asking a Jew what is Roman Catholicism. It's difficult for me to define, but theosophy at its heart is this pursuit of truth. The phrase is the highest religion is truth. And you have different iterations of theosophy. They've had way more schisms than Freemasonry has had. So to say one form of theosophy is just like another is a little difficult. But for Besant, theosophy had sort of a very high spiritual element. You had, instead of masters who were human beings, you had masters that were sort of, could materialize out of thin air and that sort of thing.
Or mystical.
And very mystical. But you also had this idea of received knowledge. I think we talked about it last night. The founder of Theosophy, Helena Blavatsky, she wouldn't have said it this way, but this is the way I describe it. Her form of theosophy is the kingdom of God is in here. And so it's all in here.
Inside.
It's all inside. It's all about personal self-improvement. It's all about your own personal path, your own journey. For Besant, the kingdom of God is out here. If it's all in here, you don't need world teachers. And you don't need the smells and bells of the church. And you don't need a lot of this structure. But if the kingdom of God is out here, you need all of those things. And so for Besant and for Co-masonry, Co-masonry starts to take on, and Freemasonry in general, because a lot of this comes out of European Masonry. She starts to aggrandize things that happen in Europe that don't happen so much here. For instance, we use incense and that sort of thing. And the ritual for a Co-mason in this country, they have chickens too. The ritual for a Co-masonry in this country is very strict and very rigid and very precise. And that is an outgrowth of this idea that you need this structure and to build yourself and to build the larger superstructure.
Sorry, we're
The wild jingle.
we're in the country now, Karen. So I think the dog's chasing the chickens on the front porch.
Oh,
it sounded
is that what
like.
that was?
Yeah, something was chasing the chicken. That's probably one of the dogs. Okay, so I don't want to beat this theosophical horse to death, but it plays such an important part in the rest of the story going forward that I just want to make sure everybody understands. So there's something called the Theosophical Society.
There are many versions of them, but yes.
But at the time there was one.
No.
At the time, I mean, when Besant was bringing Co-masonry to England.
Sadly, no. I say
They already
sadly.
had schisms.
Schisms are such sad things. Besant herself represents a form of schism, even though she is the...
In 1903?
By 1903, remember, Theosophy is much older than Co-masonry.
Right.
By 1903, you've got Tingley in this country. You've got, I think at that point, you have four, might have only been three, but four versions of Theosophy.
I see, but she was originally a student of Blavatsky, right? I mean, she was contemporary with and a student of Blavatsky. So would that have been in 1903? Would she have been still close with Blavatsky?
Blavatsky died a couple of decades earlier.
I see.
So we're not talking about...
I just want to get the history. I want to get the timeline right.
It's a very fluid thing, and it can be very difficult to think of history in terms of decades. Things don't happen... Things that happened in 1900 didn't necessarily happen in 1890.
Right.
And so you have a lot of history in Theosophy with Besant before she gets to Co-masonry.
I see. Okay, good. So she's a Theosophist.
Yes.
She's bringing Co-masonry to England.
England initially,
UK.
And then she brings it to much of the rest of the English-speaking world. So South Africa, Australia, India, Ceylon, wherever there are other English-speaking, basically the British Empire.
And she is trying to put theosophical ideas into Co-masonry.
Yes.
And she's very much a proponent of marrying the two together.
Yes.
But not everybody, and I'm paraphrasing kind of what I'm leading you down the road that we talked about last night.
Yeah.
Not everybody in Co-masonry was also a theosophist.
No.
And this started a problem.
Yeah, because it's always unpleasant to discuss schisms in Freemasonry, because Freemasonry encourages harmony, and harmony is incredibly important in a lodge. And the difficulty is you don't always have that. And so, there were schisms in Co-masonry, not so much in North America. This is where you start to look at the differences between North American Co-masonry and the rest of the English-speaking world. You had a total of 4 schisms before everything settled down. And most of those schisms, actually all of those schisms, were related to difficulties between theosophists and non-theosophists.
Okay, so 1903, Besant trying to marry up Co-masonry.
She's 1902.
1902.
1903 is North America. That's where we get Antoine Mazzarelli bringing Co-masonry on his own. He's not a theosophist. He is in no way connected to Annie Besant.
Okay. So in America, while Annie's doing all that, what happens in America?
We don't entirely know his motivations, but Antoine Mazzarelli, my research indicates that he knew the founders of I don't think he knew Marie de Rem, but he knew Georges Martin. And in 1902, shortly after Besant, I haven't been able to document it, But shortly after Anne Besant begins talking to George Martin about putting Co-masonry in Great Britain, Mazzarelli, out of the blue, starts writing to George Martin saying, I want to do this in North America.
Was he living in North America at the time?
Yes, he had been here since 1877. He was an educator. He wore many hats, but he was primarily an educator by that time.
Was he French?
He was French.
I see.
He had been master of a lodge in Paris, and he relocated to this country in 1877, and was around quite a while, and very influential in educational circles. This is where the word co comes from, because the word co-ed meant co-education. And so he is applying an educational term to Freemasonry. He doesn't want to adopt the French, I don't know why, but he doesn't want to adopt the word mixed. He wants to say co. My guess is because it was such a big deal in educational circles in the early 20th century, he wanted to adopt an already well-known and popular phrase.
Keep talking, Karen.
I will keep talking. We'll catch the cat. So Antoine is talking to George Martin, who at that point is the head of Co-masonry in Paris. He wants to bring Co-masonry to North America. And he's sort of an odd one out when it comes to founders of Co-masonry worldwide. He doesn't have an ulterior motive. He's not trying to use Freemasonry as a vehicle for anything but Freemasonry. He wants to bring a mixed option in this country. He also wants to bring an option that's more available to immigrants. Remember, this is the early 20th century in the melting pot. And at this point, it is extremely difficult for immigrants to become Freemasons in this country. Freemasonry has become very insular, and it's very much a white male thing. Not to say they don't have foreigners, particularly French, in lodges, but it is difficult, particularly Italians, poorer immigrants. So he wants the option for women, but he also wants this option for immigrants. But he wants it for Masonry's sake. So where Anne Besant wants it to be a vehicle for Theosophy, and as the later co-founder of Co-masonry in this country initially wanted it as a vehicle for socialism and labor rights, Mazzarelli is Masonry for its own sake.
Interesting. What would they have called themselves at the time? Was this Le Droit Humain?
Le Droit Humain, I'm a little fuzzy on when they adopted the phrase Le Droit Humain. Prior to that, they were Grand Loge Mixte. And there is still a Grand Loge Mixte in France, so we can't get too confused. But they had various titles before they settled on Le Droit Humain. And Droit Humain is very important because it harkens back to French Republican history. The human rights. Droit Humain means human right. So Le Droit Humain pulls in some of that French history that doesn't necessarily mean much in this country. Now, and just to be clear, the order I belong to is no longer a part of Le Droit Humain. There was a grand divorce back in the 1990s, and so now I belong to the order that is referred to as the Honorable Order of Universal Co-masonry, the American Federation of Human Rights.
But Le Droit Humain still exists?
Yes.
And is large in France?
Oh, it's huge in France.
Yeah. Okay. All right, cool. So Mazzarelli is bringing stuff here.
Yes.
He's creating lodges.
Yes, a
All
lot.
right. And then what happens?
Well, he passes, I think I told you, he committed suicide in 1908. And this is difficult for a lot of Co-masons to swallow. He also founded lodges a bit too rapidly. I think I told you last night. He adopted them on the Starbucks model. There were 50 lodges created in 5 years, and that's a lot.
That's a lot.
And there was not a lot of education going on. He would found a lodge and leave. And so by the time he died, only about half of these lodges were still functioning. And it was left to his successors to bring order out of that chaos. And his primary successor was Louis Wazoo. And he is the one that Co-masons in this country tend to revere usually as the founder. They tend to forget that Antoine came before him. But he was famous in this country already. He was probably the most famous socialist, French socialist of his time. He had been a coal miner, and he came from a very poor background. But he had been adopted by a woman who had some wealth. So it's not like he was always from a difficult background. He was fairly well educated as coal miners go, but he was a big proponent of labor rights. And for him, for a time, not forever, but for about 10 years, co-masonry for him was a vehicle for socialism and labor rights. And so you don't really have him working for theosophy in co-masonry, but he does have theosophists on his staff, and there are theosophists in lodges. And he said there was room in this country for lodges of theosophy and lodges that were not. And so he forged a middle path between the two, which was very successful in this country for quite a long time.
And why did you said for about 10 years he was a proponent of socialism. Why did he go away from that?
There's a lot of story behind all of this, but basically what happened was he was worn down. For him, socialism was not communism. He's becoming physically ill. His wife has died. He's had a number of tragedies in his life by this time. He is physically unwell. He's dying. And socialism is going in a direction he can't follow. He simply can't go in. It's heading into communism. And that's not where he wanted to go. And so for him, it's like his life was not a total failure, but everything he worked for was going away, and he thought he was going away.
And you said the Russian Revolution played a big part in his change of thinking.
A huge part. Now, of course, that's happening as he's making these decisions.
Right.
But in 1916, which is before all the problems in Russia, but things are happening, and he knows where they're going, and he thinks he's dying. He sells most of his possessions. He gives his business to his son, and he goes to Larkspur. We've just founded the headquarters in Larkspur. He goes to Larkspur to die. He thinks he's gone. But 3 months later, he is well enough that he's pouring bricks, he's doing farm work, he is completely healed, and he lived another 20 years.
Wow.
Most people say that's a miracle, and I've been to Larkspur. Larkspur is a very special place.
So, in America, as things are progressing along, you said there's some theosophy that's starting to creep into the lodges where it wasn't initially?
I'm not so much creep in, and I don't want to make it sound negative. There are very few forms of masonry that aren't driven by something. You have affinity lodges, particularly in Europe, where everybody's a musician, or everybody's an engineer, or everybody is something. Masonry is very seldom a pure thing. So I don't want to make this sound horribly negative. It's just what it was, and it's just what happened. But you had people, Louis said we could have lodges of theosophy. There were lodges that were all theosophists, or mostly theosophists. In the Great Depression, which started 32, 33, hit co-masonry in this country very hard. We came very close to disappearing. And by this time, Louis has passed away. His successor is Edith Armour. Now, she wanted to follow his middle path. If you read her early stuff, she's trying to maintain this idea that you can have lodges of theosophy and lodges that are not, and that's okay. But she's also trying to keep the order alive, and this is becoming more and more difficult. And she's herself a theosophist. When she goes to towns where she's trying to drum up more membership, she's staying in the homes of her theosophical friends, and they're all saying to her, hey, we can get you more members if you could make co-masonry just a little more theosophically friendly.
And by this time, Annie Bazana's dead.
Oh, she'd been dead for, half a decade by that time.
Yeah.
So this isn't something that Bazant did. And this isn't something that you can say any one person did. And you can't say it's wrong. What I try to explain is this is a part of the evolution of co-masonry in this country. But what she did, most unintentionally, she never intended it to be an entirely theosophical thing. But by the mid-1940s, it is. It is. I have a difficult time by about 1944 or 1945 pointing to any co-mason in the country, active, who is not a theosophist. And there was very briefly in the late 30s, early 40s, a bit of a struggle between lodges that were not theosophists and lodges that were. And by 45, there are no non-theosophical lodges left. But the difficulty with that is, for a little while, you improve your membership, But by the late 30s, Theosophy itself is in decline. Now, it's never going to go away because they have infrastructure, they have money, they have resources. It's one of these things that's just never going to go away. But because Co-masonry had tied its wagon to Theosophy, when the number of Theosophists went down, our numbers went down. And if you look at photographs of Co-masons in the 1950s, in particular going into the 60s, everybody's getting older. You're not seeing new members coming in. So in the 1960s, there's the great move to make it less entirely friendly for not negative. We still certainly welcome Theosophists, but we also welcome Roman Catholics, we welcome Baptists, we welcome Jews, we welcome Muslims. We now become more open and more inclusive. And Co-masonry stops becoming a vehicle of Theosophy and starts evolving more toward Freemasonry for its own end. And in its way, modern Co-masonry is more that way Masonically than just about any other order on earth. But we have this difficult isn't the right word. You have this evolutionary process where we go through periods where we're less like that. But nothing is perfect when it's founded, and we're not perfect now.
Cool. So what happens then?
Oh, I just brought us into the modern period. So
Brought us into the modern period. Nice transition. Okay, so your order so there was another schism, right? When you were telling me about the people that were trying to get Larkspur and...
Oh, well, that wasn't really a schism per se. That was more of a divorce. Le Droit Humain, we got along with Le Droit Humain as long as there was an ocean and there was no internet and there really were no phones to speak of, and the best you could do was a telegram. And Co-masonry on the French model is difficult for North America. French Masonry has a do not ask, do not tell policy when it comes to belief in a supreme being. That is an attitude that works really well in France, given their history. But given history in this country, it's not going to work. Now, we already, in today, the order, I shouldn't say we so much, it's the order I belong to. I'm nobody great in the order I belong to. But the order I belong to requires belief in a supreme being. This is an outgrowth of North American Freemasonry. There is always this difficulty between us and France, always. And the word I use in the book on North American Co-masonry is prevarication. We would receive an edict from Paris that we didn't like, so we would pretend we didn't see it. Or we would ignore it or misunderstand it. And then...
Yeah, we do that in North Carolina.
Well, of course.
We don't.
Well, of course.
Some lodges do.
But some lodges do. But it's difficult when it's local. Because when you're local, your Grand Lodge can come and say, wait a minute, no, we meant that.
Right.
But if your lodge is in a totally different country and you have to get on a ship to deal with things, things slide.
Right.
But with the advent of telephones, airplanes, the internet, this became more and more difficult to do. And things became, and there's a lot of history to this. I'm glossing over a lot of stuff. But what basically happened was the prevarication that was happening on both sides became less and less viable. And it came to a head in the 1990s. And Le Droit Humain would say that we left. We would say that they left. Technically, legally speaking, they left us. But really, it was a divorce. It was who was going to get to the divorce attorney first. And then there was the squabbling over custody rights after the children. Le Droit Humain decided to charter a new organization in Delaware, which is not, Delaware is a very corporate-friendly place. That's why it's in Delaware. In doing that, legally they left us, but we wanted out too. So it's not fair to say, I just basically say there was a divorce. We both wanted out. And in the divorce, Le Droit Humain is now its own organization, and the Honorable Order of Universal Co-masonry is its own order. And honestly, you know, Mazzarelli said in the beginning, he told George Martin, if you ever encroach upon our autonomy, we will leave. And we did.
And that's where we are today.
That's where my order is. Remember, Le Droit Humain is still in this country.
Right.
They're significantly smaller. We remain the largest co-masonic body in North America. But Le Droit Humain is still active. and they are still attached to Paris. They still hold charters and all that from Paris. But there is no amity agreement between the order I belong to and Le Droit Humain.
Cool. Brown, what we'll probably do, I think that was a pretty good synopsis of the history. Maybe we'll break this thing into part 1 and part 2, because now we'll kind of transition away from your specific history, and I just kind of want to talk about women in Masonry in general.
I don't mean to interrupt, but
go ahead.
Co-masonry, there are men too.
Yes.
So when we talk about women in Masonry in general, then we start talking about the female craft lodges, and I'm a little fuzzier on those.
Okay. So, but I know the guys will be interested in that. So.
Some of the ladies are too.
And some of the ladies are too. Yes, they are. So, as it stands today, women in Freemasonry generally fall into, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, 2 broad categories. One is all-female Masonry, and one is co-masons, which are mixed lodges of men and women.
Yes.
Fair enough? Okay, so because you were telling me that you don't know the all-female stuff as good, and let's get them out of the way first, because that'll probably go pretty quick. Do you know how many Grand Lodges of those type there are? You said that there was a lodge in England, you were telling me, that is pretty chummy with the Grand Lodge of England, or at least they have a relationship where they aren't at loggerheads.
I thought we were still in North America. That's why I was
Yeah, that's
a little
okay.
confused. The largest female-only order in the world is the Honorable Order of Women Freemasons, and they actually evolved from Co-masonry. This was the first great schism in Co-masonry, in Byzantine Co-masonry, in 1907. And you have Fielding, and you have a bunch of other people. At this point, they're a mixed lodge, but they are responding to Theosophy. They don't want Theosophical Masonry, and so they found.
In the UK.
In the UK.
Okay.
At this point, they're referred to, I got to get this straight, because there are 2 women's orders active in Great Britain, and I want to make sure I get these names straight, and I'm not even going to try. They have a different name when they start out. In 1935, there's a lot of unofficial stuff going on. There's this unofficial agreement between this order that had come out of Co-masonry and had been Co-masonic. There is an agreement that they will no longer admit men.
With the UGLE. Agreement with the UGLE.
Yes.
Okay.
And this is where they start to pick up the nickname UGLE in skirts. Because they adopt the ritual of the United Grand Lodge of England, but they stop admitting men. But there's this tacit understanding between them that the guys will be over here in the United Grand Lodge of England, and the women will be over here in what is now referred to as the Honorable Order of Women Freemasons. And they have a lot of mutual projects. Mm-hmm. They do a lot of fundraising together. When they had, back in 1907, when they had the 100th anniversary of the Honorable Order of Women Freemasons, they had a year-long celebration at Freemasons Hall on Great Queen Street in London. So there's a lot of interaction between them, and has been for decades. But it's always been sort of sub rosa.
Yeah.
And there's never been any amity agreements, nothing formal. There's nothing more than just this understanding between them that's gone on for a long time.
Cool. And so they're strong and vibrant and exist today. Do they have a presence in the United States?
No.
At all?
At all.
Okay.
Neither does the United Grand Lodge of England.
True. Okay. So are there other all-female orders?
Oh, many.
Do you know any of them, or how many there are?
I know quite a few. I don't know I don't know the number.
Give us a broad synopsis of what that looks like.
Well, in continental Europe.
And especially any that have a presence in the States.
Okay, we can go there. There aren't many here. I refer to it as a toehold. The Grande Loge Belgique, Grande Loge des Feminines, the Feminine Grand Lodge of Belgium. I was going to try and do it in French, but it's not happening. They have a handful of lodges. I think they're in New York and in Los Angeles. Then you have, we're sticking with all female lodges. There's a Grand Lodge, she's going to hate me. I can't remember the name of the Grand Lodge that was founded in California last year.
The Spanish one. You were telling me about.
Yep, I think they're mostly Spanish. I'm so sorry. She knows who she is, and she's going to be so mad at me.
It'll come to you when you're not trying to think of it.
Yeah, about 4 a.m. tomorrow morning, it'll all come back to me. That's the only women's-only Grand Lodge that I know of. And they are, like the relationship with the United Grand Lodge of England, They have a sort of tacit understanding with the male-only Grand Lodge of California that they're there, everything's fine, there's no invasion going on, but that they want to have an all-female option. And so their lodges are in California, and I suppose they'll go elsewhere. But that's, as far as I know, is the only Grand Lodge in this country. I'm trying to remember the other all-women's order. And of course, I'm sure my friends who are in the esoteric Freemasons will point out they have all-women options. But they don't have brick and mortar locations. And of course, Memphis Miss Rain has always had mixed and not mixed options. And there are people who will say they're not Masons, but I get along with them, okay?
And they're active in the States?
Oh, yes. Now, Memphis Miss Rain, they had their 99-degree system. It's not Scottish Rite, it's not York Rite, it's not English Rite. It's its own little thing. But it tends to operate within sort of this outer sphere of Freemasonry.
Do you know what ritual the all-female orders are working? You said that the one in England is working emulation, right?
Emulation type, you have to be careful because there's no such thing as just pure emulation. The best you're going to do is emulation lodge of instruction. They send people around to instruct people on emulation, but then you end up with things like working Taylor, types of emulation. So when you say emulation, it is
a version of emulation.
And so even in my order, where it's basically 80% emulation, it's not. You can't just call it emulation. In fact, we call it. Well, I know its name is Lauderdale. But so when you say it's emulation, there's no such animal.
Okay, so mainly you're saying that there are two all-female ones that are kicking around here in the States, but they're small.
They're small.
Okay, so let's go to the Co-mason orders that operate in the States.
Okay.
Okay, tell us about them.
Oh well, I thought I did. Our headquarters is in Larkspur, Colorado.
Yes. And because we're going to break this into probably two segments, the history segment and then this segment, just hit it again. What is the name of your order? What
the Honorable Order, and I need to get this all straight because we've had a change. In fact, I said it wrong earlier. We've had a change in our name. We are the Honorable Order of Universal Co-masonry, the United Federation of Lodges. We've dropped the American Federation of Human Rights.
Right.
I don't know why. I should say I'm no one great in the order. If you want anything official, you would have to talk to them. I can speak from my own experience and my own observation. Oh, no, I am no one. The most official I ever became was until recently, actually just last month. I was master of my lodge, but that's as official as I got. I'm not. In the U.S., I think you referred to it as the Grand Line. We don't call it that. But I'm no one great in the order.
You are to us, Karen. You're great to us.
Thank you.
And we appreciate you being here. Okay, so you guys are one of the Co-Masonic orders, and by and large, the biggest, yes, in the States.
We are by far the largest.
You're the biggest game in town.
Yes.
All right. But there's still some other Co-Masonic orders that are kicking around to some degree.
Let me think now. La Doyenne, of course, is still here. It's difficult for me to gauge size because I don't have access to numbers in the order I belong to. I certainly don't have access to theirs. And then, of course, there is. I should have written some of this down. There are other Co-Masonic orders. They tend to be smaller. I'm thinking of our friends in Salt Lake City, but I can't remember the name of their order. That's terrible. I should remember. I should just know. I have it in the paper. I'm very good at when reading.
That's cool.
But yeah, there are smaller Co-Masonic orders.
Okay, so let's just talk about y'all's version of Masonry for a minute. You said that you guys are working a version that you called maybe 80% emulation.
No.
You told me last night that y'all started off doing French ritual.
Yeah, he worked whatever ritual he'd get a hold of because Mazzarelli is founding lodges very fast. But he is himself a French Mason. And so the first lodge in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, they were working the French Rite, and I can document that they were working the French Rite into the 1940s. They never varied. But he had Norwegians, he had Italians, he had all these different languages, and there was no set ritual for them to work, and there was no ritual uniformity, really until after his time. And I have a 35-page paper on the evolution of Co-Masonic ritual. So I'm trying to do it quickly, but as you can see, I do nothing quickly.
That's okay. We've got nothing but time.
But Wazoo wanted something more unifying. And so in his time, he didn't develop it himself, but in his time was developed something that was referred to as the North American ritual, which I have copies of, I've never seen myself. And that was worked into the 1990s. But as that's happening, you see the evolution of emulation type ritual in Co-masonry. It goes through various iterations until we arrive at what is now referred to as the Lauderdale. And what makes the Lauderdale difficult to name is it existed about a decade before it was referred to as the Lauderdale. It picks up its name Lauderdale because at that point the British Federation's headquarters is on Lauderdale Road in London. So that's where you get the name of it. But it's about 80% emulation, but it has French elements, it has elements of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. You have two types of ritual pulling out of Scotland that pour into our ritual. We have things out of Irish workings. We have all these other different elements. So it's 80% emulation. The North American ritual had some Preston Webb stuff in it that the Lauderdale does not have. And without getting into any details, that's important.
Yeah, so, I just find this whole conversation so fascinating because our North Carolina guys, are so used to such a structured ritual. If you say a lodge when you're supposed to say this lodge, somebody's going to holler out from the sidelines, that's supposed to say this lodge.
Oh, wow.
And we have, the ritual police come along once a year. We have to go to a ritual thing where we brush up on our ritual, and then every other year we have to do this other ritual thing where we brush up on our ritual, and it's so rigid and structured. It's just so alien to talk about the development of ritual in both your order and other orders as it changes. It seems like there could be no change in our ritual, which is probably a good thing for where we are now.
But
it's very natural that ritual in different orders evolved.
Yes,
right?
But let's be careful here because we are not very casual. We're very precise in our ritual, and I'm trying to encapsulate a century of evolution. It's not like everything happened quickly. There's been ritual uniformity in Co-masonry in this country for approaching 30 years. Mm-hmm. And believe me, we're bullets straight. The way you hold your hands in lodge and calling out from the columns doesn't happen.
Yeah, I wish it didn't happen here.
Oh my goodness, nothing's going to get you into trouble faster. There is no commentary from the columns.
Good for y'all. Wish you could teach us some of that.
I guess it just doesn't happen.
Well, good. It's interesting though. I wonder how the ritual does evolve. I guess occasionally. I mean, how do things creep into anybody's ritual? You think they have one day they say, okay, let's do a ritual review. We're going to form a committee and see if there's anything we need to change. Or I wonder if it's more lodges just start doing something that kind of becomes a custom that eventually becomes part of the actual ritual.
I think it's human nature. We strive for ritual uniformity, but it's elusive. Even in my own lodge, when my district deputy will visit, and she visits periodically. It's not like we've never seen her before, but there will be little subtle errors that have crept in, since she was there 6 months prior, mm-hmm. and we haven't even noticed it happened. So I think it's just human nature. Things happen. Of course, there's also the situation where we do have members who remember the North American ritual. And so I'll see something. Right now I'm thinking about, I'm not going to say exactly what it was because that's just too descriptive. But there was an element that was starting to creep into our ritual in my lodge that I had just thought was a way of doing it. I didn't realize it was wrong.
Right.
But it's not wrong exactly. It's just that he picked it up from a brother who had been brought up under the North American ritual. Right. And he saw a brother who saw the North American ritual and said, "Oh, that looks cool. I'm going to do that." And then, as master, I didn't see a problem with it.
And it's funny. It's just for our North Carolina guys, and we are a North Carolina show. Well, I guess we're not anymore, are we? Whatever.
The internet is seldom local.
I mean, we have something similar. I mean, there's a thing. what's the thing? The mariner, the guy that's sitting.
Wayfarer.
The wayfarer. So there's this thing called the way. It's not in our ritual at all. I'd never heard of it. I learned our ritual out of the, by the book and by the letter. And then I go to Salisbury when we started Sophia, and they're like, oh, who's going to be the wayfarer? I'm like, what's a wayfarer? I don't even know what that is. Oh, he's this guy that sits over here and does this part of the ritual. Never heard of such a thing. And so, when you bring that up to the ritual police, some of the ritual police were there, and I'm like, what is this? They're like, oh, yeah, that's a thing. Well, but it's not in the book. So on one hand, we're so rigid, but at the same time, we've got these local customs that everybody's like, oh, yeah, that's a thing. You can just do that. It's weird. I guess that's how, and so I don't know if at some point that was a part of our ritual and now it's kind of slowly dying off, or if that's some new thing that 100 years from now will be more ingrained in our ritual. I don't know where it came from, and I'm a little surprised at the ritual police here that they just wink and nod it and say okay, which I don't really care one way or the other. It's pretty much the same words. It's just a different dude saying it, but I just find it funny. It seems to me that you can't be one dead on word perfect ritual police, and at the same time we'll just have this thing that's just local custom. Just do it. I don't know. It's weird. They'll get so jacked up over a word in the ritual, but at the same time there's this big thing like this other dude doing part of the ritual.
A whole position that we didn't know about.
Yeah, and that's no big deal. It's just weird what they find important and what they don't.
It's the flavor. This is the local flavor. Every lodge has a local flavor.
I like that. I love the idea. Like when I went to Scotland, they all do. They're all different. Every lodge is a little different in the way that they do their ritual, and I like that. Their aprons, they look different. They wear different color aprons, and different. A lodge will adopt an apron. They may be green, and yours may be blue, and yours may be red. So when they sit in lodge together, there is a you're all the same, but there's a uniqueness.
Well, it's like visiting.
And we don't have that here. Everybody wears the exact same thing here.
Well, the order I belong to, we do have the same apron. We do have the same. If you're in one of the chairs, you'll wear the same collar. That's pretty uniform. But it's like visiting your cousins or your aunt's house.
Yeah.
It's the same family.
Yeah.
But they do things differently there.
I'm not sure which I like better. I kind of like elements of both ways of doing things. Anyway, we're off on a tangent, so it doesn't really matter. Okay. So Co-masons pretty much operate as we're used to, though, in that their lodges are kind of the same, have pretty much the same officers.
Yeah, we're members of the same family, but things are done differently there. Yes.
All right. Here's something everybody wants to know, but is afraid to ask. When you take a candidate into the preparation room and you're preparing them, do you send, if you have a lady that's going to be an initiate, do you send lady stewards back to prepare her?
Well, we don't have stewards, so
okay.
That's a whole other thing. I can document.
I don't want to get into specifics that we can't talk about,
okay.
But we always a lot of guys have asked about that. I'm like, I don't know how they do it.
Well, usually we tell them how to. It's men and women. We tell them put this on. We tell them how to put it on.
Yeah.
It's up to them.
I see.
Only as much as is required by the ritual is revealed.
Yeah.
And if you give that some thought, you'll realize that things don't have to be revealed.
Gotcha. Yeah. Huh. Interesting.
And if they reveal too much, we adjust it.
I understand. So then once you're initiated, do you guys return a catechism? Do you learn a catechism from memory and return that?
I didn't understand what you meant by return.
Yeah, that's probably a North Carolina
different
word.
I don't know. It's a different nomenclature. I tried to adapt.
So you have a coach that teaches you the words of the catechism.
We refer to them as mentors, but yes.
Yes. And so they teach you both the ways of Masonry and the words to return your catechism.
Yeah, and their catechism has been revised fairly recently. It has gone through its own evolution. It's much longer than it used to be.
Sure, all the coaches love that. Doggone it, got to learn something different.
Oh, yes.
Got to unlearn this and relearn that.
When I've been examining a candidate for advancement, since I came up where there were fewer questions, I stumbled because, I don't remember this one. And I find myself having to glance at the notes because I have to ask the new person or the new candidate different questions than I was asked. I came in, there was like 2 pages. Now it's like 4.
Here's something interesting Karen told me last night. Their order is growing.
We have been for a long time, yes.
Yeah, so where everybody is losing their mind because we're shrinking, they're on the other path.
Yeah, but
they're getting bigger.
I think, but it's handy to understand why you're shrinking. You have history too.
Right.
I brought this up when I was at the International Conference on the History of Freemasonry. I was sitting with brothers from the United Grand Lodge of England. They were lamenting how small they're getting, and I said, "Well, wait a minute. You had this artificial boom."
Right.
After World War II, Masonry isn't supposed to be so inclusive. It really isn't.
Right.
Not everyone can be a
Agreed.
Freemason. And I think you all went through, and this is me talking out of school, because I'm not a Mailcraft Mason. But it just looks to me, I don't think you're getting small so much as you're returning to a more normal number.
It was artificially inflated, and now we're getting back to where we're supposed to be.
Yeah.
There's just some pain involved with that.
Well, yeah, it's like cutting
Because-
off. It's like cutting off these artificial growths
Yeah.
that you got used to, but they really impede your movement.
Right. And they impede your money.
Well, no, y'all
And your
have,
money impedes the way that you do business.
one of the benefits of Mailcraft Masonry in this country, having been largely an outer order activity, basically more of a social group, is you're better with money. You have trust funds, and so I'm not going to say money
Better
is
in that sense.
better in that sense. This is where you have the great a division between Co-masonry, which is basically an inner order, or traditionally has been an inner order, not so good at the money. Your resources are good because of that those numbers, and a lot of those resources won't go away. You had huge building projects, and I've been to the George Washington Memorial in Washington, D.C., and it's huge. I don't think there are temples in Greece that are this big.
Right.
And that's not going away.
Yeah.
And so you have a lot of resources that you can build upon that was left by that generation. So
Yeah.
there are benefits to numbers, but yeah.
Well, we'll say this. In North Carolina, our leaders are not focused on the numbers and the money quite in the way that some of the grand jurisdictions are, I think. Our guys are always saying, we want Masons, not members.
Well, they have to be a little.
No, you have to be a little,
because
yeah.
they are the front office.
Yeah.
And so they have to keep the lights on.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just proven difficult. It'll all shake out.
Oh, yeah.
But getting back to a richer and thicker and more condensed version of Masonry is a good thing in my mind. There's just going to be some pain involved in getting there. When you have, when you got this many bills and you're downsizing, you got to get rid of some, you got to shed some stuff, right? Or you got to, so the guys are going to have to pay more, or we're going to have to get rid of some stuff if our numbers are going to continue to go down. And I think they're going to continue to go down, and I think that's a good thing. But there's going to be some pain involved. But we'll get there. We'll get there. But I'm glad to hear that you guys are growing. It's good.
But we're not the only order in the world that's growing. And if you go to France, the Grand Orient, the largest Masonic order in France, their numbers are hugely increasing.
Which is also Co. You said.
Well, it is now.
It is now. As of a couple of
traditionally.
years ago, you said.
I want to say 3 or 4, but yes, they accept women now.
Do you think that's why they're growing?
No, they were already starting to grow. French Masonry is its own thing. I'm really happy when I'm in Paris, because when I'm in Paris, I can go to lodge. No one even blinks that I'm female. It doesn't even come up. They have male-only lodges. You can't go there. That's fine. They can't go to the women-only lodges. I can go to those if I want to. But I have also been in female craft lodges in Paris where they won't allow men to join, but they'll let them visit. And I've been in lodges that are female craft, but the men at that particular meeting outnumbered the women. So to me, it looks co-Masonic.
Yeah.
But to them, they're still female craft because those men are not actually members.
Yeah, that's just so it's so alien to us that that all those things would coexist together. But I like it. I like the idea of it.
Well, once you get used to it, it's not alien. And I'm a big proponent of choice.
Yeah.
You should have this option.
Yeah, I told Karen the story last night when we went to the Grand Orient. They have a fabulous museum.
Yes.
And so we went to the museum when we were in Paris, and they're like, apparently there's a bunch of lodges. We didn't go to a lodge room. Apparently they're upstairs though, or behind some other building. Wherever they were, they said, "Come on to lodge." And we were staying right there.
You're talking about Rue Cadet.
Yeah. That's where we stayed.
Gosh, I've never counted the floors. I think it's 11 stories. You could have dozens of lodge meetings going on at the same time. I've been in lodge meetings and at Rucadet, and I have to predicate by saying my order's not in amity with any of these orders in Paris, but I've had no trouble attending lodge. Things are very fluid in Paris.
Yeah, they told us, they said, come on to lodge. I'm like, well, we don't have recognition with you. And they're like, well, you're initiated. Don't worry about it. Come on.
Yeah.
And we were very tempted, but we didn't do it. But they didn't care. I mean, they just said, come on.
Well, the ritual tells us how we know we're brothers.
That's right.
But then you can do it at the individual brothers level. I run around pretty free, but I don't represent my order. If I was, say, the Grand Orator, or if I had a grand in front of my name, then yeah, I would have to think twice, because I'm representing, at that point, I would be representing my order, and then I just wouldn't go to lodge in Paris. But I'm just me.
Right. Well, but the difference between us is that, as we talked about last night, in our obligation, we specifically prohibit our members from intervisitation with people with which we are not in amity.
And this is where I can get into a debate.
So there's rules of man and there's rules of your oath, right?
Yes, but then you start looking, this is where being a historian is really helpful. Arguably, there's a part in my obligation that would say I shouldn't go. But I do not personally interpret it that way. I am not specifically told in my obligation, you will not go to this lodge.
Right.
It's a different wording.
But that's the thing, Karen. If it wasn't specific in ours, and I was open to interpret it, I mean, if there was even a crack in the door that I could interpret it, that I could go.
There's always a crack.
Then I would probably, interpret it that way and go. But ours is pretty doggone specific, and not every order's obligation is that specific. And Karen and I didn't talk about the exact wording, but apparently your wording is a little looser than ours, and I think that's the case in many Grand Lodges, that they aren't as tied down with specific wording as we are, maybe. And again, without talking about the specific wording, that's the sense that I get in talking to people from other Grand Lodges, including you.
Right, but bear in mind, though, the heads of my order always had the option of yanking me back.
Yeah.
And they never did, but they could have.
Right.
So it isn't so much what I do. There's also a certain amount of, okay, this is just what Karen's going to do and we can't stop her.
Right.
There has to be someone willing to do that. Now, I'm not a trailblazer, but I am proof that it can be done. I didn't burst into flames, and
Right.
nothing negative happened to me.
Well, so this leads to an interesting question.
Okay?
One thing that I don't like that we do is we obligate people to things during their ritual that we don't tell them in advance what they're going to be. So there you are in the middle of ritual, and you're obligating yourself before God and your brothers to do or not do certain things that you had no idea was coming. And you have an option to, at that point, say, no, I'm not going to obligate myself to that. But it's a pretty doggone, you're in a position where it's pretty doggone hard to say I'm not going to do that at that point. You have that option, but nobody does, because it would be awkward.
Well, it depends on who's enforcing the obligation. Usually that's an individual thing.
Well, that's right. So there's both. There's the rules on one hand, the law of man, and then there's your interpretation of what your obligation actually is. And I have, for the most part, kept all my obligations to the best of my ability.
I think so too.
But I have spoken ill of a brother. There's some of them that, in anger or, whatever. We've all done it. We've all broken some of our obligations.
Yeah, but I would argue that the only oscillator...
But I usually did them... Go ahead.
The only oscillator you should work on is your own.
Yeah, but this is the question. If you specifically said that you were not going to do something, how can you do it if it's open to interpretation? Especially when you've had time to think about it. Hey, you know what this reminds me of? You remember The Machine talking about... you probably not going to get the reference, Karen, but there's a comedian called The Machine, and he was talking about the fact that he would never ever cheat on his wife because he's had time to think about that. But he got presented an opportunity to rob a train in Russia. It's a long story. Go look up the machine on YouTube if anybody's interested in this. And he said, the problem was I hadn't had time to think about what would happen if somebody told me to rob a train. He just did it. So, sometimes I break my obligations out of emotion or I'm mad or something and we may, break one. But if you have time to think about it and break it, that's a little different in my opinion.
But then you get into, we talked about interpretations and breaking an obligation. Back in the 20s, we talked about this a little bit last night. The 1920s was basically the golden age of co-masonry in the world. Mm-hmm. Largest number of co-masons worldwide ever. We still had not reached that level. This is before World War II. And in this country, our numbers had become so great, and also we had, our grandmaster at the time was interested temporarily. It turned out very badly. But for a time was interested in not amity, but a sort of rapprochement with male craft masonry in this country. And you had Grand Lodges who were saying, okay, this is how we're going to get around your obligation. And they said, your obligation, and there's some logic to this. Your obligation begins and ends in this order. We will not have women in this order. But if you want to go visit a Co-Masonic Lodge, you can, because that's outside of the order. And that's how those Grand Lodges, those male-only Grand Lodges, were interpreting the obligation at that time. You won't find that now.
All I can say is that in our wording, there is not a crack in the door to do that without.
There's always a crack.
Well, we'll have to. You'll have to take my word on this, or
I do a lot.
I can't find a crack in it, and I've thought about it a lot. So, specifically the one to visiting. Specifically the Grand Orient.
If your obligation is only specific to your order, then it's not. And the reason this is important is because it means that any grand pronouncements that your order makes about mine, and mine makes about yours, are irrelevant.
Okay, well, without getting into the wording of the ritual, which we can't do, we'll just have to let this one ride. But anyway, it's a shame. It is what it is.
Well, that's just it. That is what it is. I'm a historian. I can tell you what happened. I can tell you that was the attitude of some male craft Grand Lodges in this country in the 1920s. I don't know of a Grand Lodge today that would feel that way. But that's what it was.
Right.
So if it could be interpreted that way then, it could go that way again. I don't know that it will or it won't, but it can. There's always a crack.
Well, history's always made by people breaking the rules, right?
Or following them.
Well, oftentimes people, going away from the conventional norm or even specific laws is how, history gets made. Now, treason, one man's treason is the next man's patriot, right?
Exactly.
So, I think specifically related to this that there's no crack in the door for us to do that without breaking our obligation. The question is, can we break an obligation that we didn't really have a choice in making? And do you take ownership of your obligation, and can you make a rational, logical decision, an ethical decision to break that obligation because you think it's okay between you and God? Do you think that God would be okay with you breaking this oath to Him and your fellow man? That's the way that I break it down in my mind. And we all struggle with these. So.
Well, I don't think of it as a struggle, but then again, I have a very, very liberal idea of what my obligation is.
And your obligation probably doesn't specify. It sounds like your obligation isn't as specific as ours is. Ours is worded where you probably have a crack in the door. We don't.
It's sort of a combination between emulation type. There's some words in there from Scottish workings, some Irish workings. It can get really specific, but there's always a crack. I do a lot of legal writing. There's always a crack.
Leave it to a lawyer. Okay. Well, I think maybe we beat that horse to death, so we'll move on. But maybe someday we'll see. We'll see how it goes. All right. So, if you want to find Karen's books, you can find them on Amazon. You can watch this. I'm not sure if we're going to tape her speech today at Sophia or not. Possibly. If so, you'll find it here on 357 Productions. Riley, what do you got? I see you've been making notes like crazy over there.
No, just Jotting, man. Just ideas, different things.
You've been so quiet.
He's trying to figure out how to get to the Grand Orient. That's what he's trying to do. Not get in trouble.
Find that crack.
There's a crack right here. Anything you want to ask her before we roll it out?
I'm good. I really appreciate you coming. Thank you so much.
All the way from Oregon.
That's right.
We're
All
sitting-
the way.
So she had a good flight. We're glad to have her here. Karen, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for
And
having me.
and we look forward to your speech this afternoon. And
pardon.
look, that's it. Okay. All right. So at this point, we're gonna roll on up out of here. And the Larry Thompson's favorite phrase of mine. And we would be playing some lead out music, except Brown's gonna have to lay it over because we don't have any right now because we didn't plan properly. Okay, we're out.
Thank you for listening to this episode of From Darkness to Light. For more information and productions, please visit our Facebook page at 357 Productions or visit our website at 357productions.com. As always, tell people that you love them, and remember, we meet on the level and heart on the screen.